Chapter 11. Pledging History. It was now General Superintendent Asbury, but the simplicity of the man of unworldly ideals and purposes was unaffected by the new dignity. If there was a rising of pride or self-gratulation, it was quickly repressed. A characteristic introspection came with the quiet which succeeded the haste and labors of the conference. Concerning the feelings revealed by that inquisition he wrote, "My mind was unsettled, and I was but low in my own testimony." 5 days later he made this entry in his journal: "I am sometimes afraid of being led to think something more of myself in my new situation than formerly." The preventative against an assertion of self was to dedicate himself to more than ever of the servant of his brethren, more than ever the servant of his brethren. But to one impulse born of his new relation he gave the freest rein, a hunger for wider conquest and a more rapid spread of the gospel. What had been before but a hope became now a plan for immediate realization. Even before the close of the Christmas conference, he had cast his eyes southward and southwest to the very limits of the continent, and outlined his first episcopal tour. Oh wait, the 9 on the bottom of the page was 129, okay. Even before the close of the Christmas conference, he had cast his eyes southward and southwest to the very limits of the continent, and outlined his first episcopal tour on a scale commensurate with his expanded vision. He had already, 3 years before, penetrated North Carolina and planted stations in the fertile valleys of the great rivers and even beyond the crest of the intersecting mountains. Now he determined to ride beyond the farthest Methodist outpost and come to those parts in South Carolina and Georgia that had known, nearly 50 years before, the labors of the Oxford Methodists. Charleston and even Savannah were objectives in the plan of this first Episcopal circuit. The Christmas conference adjourned at noon on January 3rd, and on the evening of that day Asbury preached the first sermon after his ordination. The next day he took the saddle. Dr. Koch was to go immediately to New York to superintend the printing of the official minutes of the conference and the new form of discipline, the first of those unique and potent little volumes that have led so large a place in the reverence of millions of Americans. The initial stage of Asbury's journey carried him into Central Virginia, where he performed his first episcopal office, the ordination of the diaconate of Reverend Henry Willis. Willis had been in charge of the work in the Holston Valley. He had been elected to the eldership by the Christmas conference, but was unable to reach the place of meeting. From this point, Asbury drafted him to be his traveling companion, and 10 days later, at a church near the North Carolina line, ordained him a presbyter, an elder. Services were held by the general superintendent almost daily, and at these the ordinances were administered. Hundreds of infants and adults were baptized, and the people long without the communion were made glad to receive the bread and wine at the hands of their own chief minister. Asbury at this time wore in the administrations, and when discouraging the gown and bands of Presbyter, the Church of England, and used the abridged prayer book, this conformity was grateful to the old church folks, that is, the former Anglicans, who then constituted the great body of American Methodists. The Catholic-spirited Presbyterians also welcomed the Methodist overseer, and being largely destitute of pastoral attention, gladly received the ordinances at his hands. With the Immersionists, it was different. They demurred. In a spirit of conciliation, Asbury began to plunge such candidates for baptism as preferred that mode. Before the end of the year, the practice was discontinued. On February, Asbury and his chaplain, so we may describe Willis, reached Salisbury, where the indomitable Jesse Lee was in charge. The gowns and bands displayed him greatly, and he satirized the innovation so mercilessly that Asbury abandoned it, and it is claimed never again appeared in public arrayed in any character of canonical frippery. Only a little while, in fact, did the prayer book foible obtain. Neither it nor the surplice was suited to the homely and impromptu spirit of American Methodism. Ritualism is a historic sign of spiritual decadence, and Methodism had been the dew of its youth. Now, ritualism in terms of, something a ritual enacts a mythology. So if it's not just some empty thing that you're in service for, it doesn't matter how free-form it is. If you're just sitting in the pews and not engaging yourself in the listening and acting internally upon the symbolism, From Salisbury, Lee accompanied the general superintendent and his traveling companion into South Carolina. Passing through the Chirrows, they reached the sea at Georgetown, from which point they passed along the coast toward Charleston, where they arrived on February 24th. Somewhat more than 2 weeks were spent in the southern metropolis, whose people Asbury found to be proud and religiously indifferent. Nevertheless, the gospel which he and his 2 helpers proclaimed made a gracious impression upon some, especially upon the family of Mr. Wells, a prosperous merchant of the place, whose guests they were during their stay. The seeds were sown. A society was organized later and placed under the charge of Elder Willis, and Charleston became from that day one of the important posts of Methodism.